The ballroom of the Plaza Astoria Hotel in Manhattan shimmered with opulence, marble floors, towering gilded columns, and chandeliers spilling light like liquid diamonds. But no matter how dazzling the decor, nothing could outshine the moment that was about to unravel. It was one of those evenings where laughter was more about networking than joy, and every smile doubled as a sales pitch. Waiters glided through the crowd with trays of champagne and delicately plated hors d'oeuvres, careful not to brush against gowns worth more than their yearly wages. Near the center of the room stood Celeste Whitman, blonde, commanding, wrapped in scarlet silk and adorned with a string of pearls that looked inherited rather than bought. Most knew her from glossy real estate ads plastered across Long Island. She was the type who whispered loudly, especially when she wanted the room to listen. Her attention landed on a man seated near a large floral arrangement in the back. He sat alone, mid-70s, maybe, deep brown skin, silver-threaded hair, posture refined and composed. His suit was neat, tailored just enough to suggest quiet dignity, though not designer. He didn't seem to mind the spotlight or the lack of it. Celeste leaned over to the woman beside her and said, loud enough for several tables to hear, "Who let the help sit with the guests?" A ripple of discomfort spread. Someone at the bar stole a glance toward the man and quickly turned away. A thin, nervous laugh rose from another corner and then faded just as quickly. The man didn't flinch. He sat poised, hands folded in his lap, eyes looking straight ahead. He didn't glance at Celeste. Didn't acknowledge her at all, but she wasn't finished. "It's a formal event, isn't it?" she said, swirling her champagne. "I didn't realize the dress code included discount suits." Nora Hastings, seated nearby, looked up. She had heard every word. Her husband leaned in and whispered, "Ignore it." Not worth it, but Nora couldn't ignore it. There was something in the man's stillness that demanded respect, not ridicule. She shifted in her seat, angling her body toward him ever so slightly, an unspoken gesture of solidarity. Celeste, unaware or uncaring, continued. "This is exactly what happens when they stop vetting the guest list properly. Ever since Lillian gave up organizing, the standards have gone downhill." The man finally moved. Slowly, he reached into his jacket, pulled out the events program, unfolded it, and adjusted it on his lap. No reaction, no words, just quiet, deliberate motion. The kind of grace forged by years of knowing who he was regardless of how others chose to see him. A man seated nearby in a tux leaned toward Celeste. His voice was soft, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. "Maybe worrying about your own shoes." Celeste blinked, caught off guard. She flashed a brittle smile and scanned the room to gauge who had overheard. Eyes had begun to shift. Conversations dimmed into murmurs. The air grew noticeably heavier. Just then, the evening's host tapped the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice smooth as velvet, "thank you for joining us at the St. Elias Foundation Gala." Applause rang out, but it couldn't quite shake off the awkwardness hanging in the room. The earlier exchange had left a mark, subtle, but undeniable. No one said anything directly, but everyone felt it, and no one forgot the man Celeste mocked. Especially when, moments later, the guest of honor stepped onto the stage and smiled wide. "I want to start tonight by recognizing the person who made my entire journey possible. Without his mentorship, I wouldn't be standing here. Please join me in honoring Mr. Walter Jennings." Every head turned, Celeste's face drained of color. The man she dismissed as beneath her stood slowly, calmly. He nodded to the host, then to the room, with the kind of humility only greatness can afford. And just like that, the woman with the loudest voice in the room realized she'd never understood a thing about power. Everyone felt it even if no one said it aloud. Walter Jennings didn't need to say a word. His stillness had already spoken louder than any of Celeste's pointed jabs. But the evening wasn't finished revealing who Walter truly was. Walter Jennings hadn't always been the quiet man sitting off to the side. Years ago, he filled spaces not just with presence but with music. Back in the late 1960s, in a small jazz club tucked away in Baton Rouge, they used to call him Walt the Keys. Before the city was overtaken by hotel chains and concrete, Walter played piano like it was stitched into his being. His left hand would set the mood, and his right would tell the story. People came just to hear how he made silence dance. But, as life often does, things shifted. In 1973, Walter left Louisiana. A flood had destroyed the tiny apartment he shared with his young wife, Lillian. No insurance, no backup, just a suitcase each and a child on the way. They landed in Newark, where music had to take a back seat. The bills didn't pause for passion. He took what jobs he could, cleaning buildings at night, mopping floors at a community college, and eventually found steady work as a janitor at St. Elias Children's Hospital downtown. He stayed there 31 years. Most staff never knew his name. Some offered polite nods, a few said thank you, but Walter was largely part of the scenery, quiet, dependable, unseen. He cleaned spills, tightened bolts, replaced light bulbs, and handed out tissues to parents whose tears had run dry. He never called in sick, not once. Except for the morning Lillian passed away. Even then, he phoned in to apologize. Back at the gala, Celeste hadn't connected the dots. To her, Walter was just another man who didn't fit the look. But Patrice Duval, a retired nurse standing by the catering table, recognized him instantly. She hadn't seen Walter in over 10 years, but his face was unforgettable. Late nights at the hospital, when kids couldn't sleep from fear or pain, Walter would hum jazz while sweeping. Same melody, always soft. It soothed more than the children, it quieted the whole ward. He kept coloring books in his supply cart, out of his own pocket, to distract the siblings who had to wait hours, sometimes days. And when the pantry ran low, he brought in granola bars and warm socks from home. Patrice stepped away from the canapes and wove through the crowd. When she reached him, she gently tapped his shoulder. "Mr. Jennings." He turned, and his face lit up with gentle recognition. "Miss Duval," he said warmly, rising from his seat. She embraced him without asking. "You look well," she said, her voice catching. "You still got that nurse's badge from '92? He asked with a quiet smile. "Pinned on my board," she laughed, eyes glinting. People nearby watched. Murmurs began to ripple. A few guests glanced his way, beginning to connect the past to the man sitting among them. But Celeste didn't notice. She was too busy scanning the room for someone richer, someone higher on the ladder. She didn't see how Walter's hands trembled slightly as he sat back down, not from age, but from memory. It had been a long time since anyone in a place like this treated him like he belonged. Patrice returned to her table and leaned toward the younger guests. "You see that man," she said, motioning to Walter. "He used to stay after hours with kids scared to fall asleep, sat with them until the nurses came. He brought granola bars when families couldn't afford a second meal. That man kept our hospital running in ways no one ever saw." "No way," one of them murmured, glancing over. "Yes way," Patrice replied with certainty. "You're looking at the heart of St. Elias, whether anyone here knows it or not. That's the thing about truth, it doesn't need applause to be real. It travels in whispers, shared looks, subtle shifts in body language." People who had barely registered Walter earlier were now watching him differently, not with pity, not guilt. With something deeper, respect. And even though Walter never once asked to be the center of anything, the room was turning toward him. By the time dessert was served and the quartet played a softer tune, something had shifted. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there. Table 9 kept glancing toward the back. Conversations had subtly tilted. "Did you hear who he is?" one person whispered. "I think he used to work at St. Elias," another replied. Even Celeste had gone quiet. She could feel it. The current had changed, and for the first time all evening, she wasn't at its center. She couldn't explain it, but she didn't like it. Across the ballroom, Patrice continued spreading quiet truth. This time, she was speaking with a well-dressed man named Theo Merriman, a young investor, who had donated 6 figures earlier that evening and was now sipping ginger ale like it was aged whiskey. "He once sat with a little boy too scared to go into surgery," she said, pointing at Walter. "Held his hand for 2 hours. Didn't tell anyone. Just did it." Theo raised an eyebrow. "Wait, that's the guy she mocked earlier." "The very same," Patrice replied. Theo looked down at his name tag, then over at Walter. "Funny, isn't it? The ones who do the most usually ask for the least." At the main table, Celeste crossed her legs and leaned in toward the couple she'd been trying to impress all night, Barrett and Angela Crowley, longtime donors with influence. She tried to recover her footing. "People are just being overly sentimental," she said sharply. "These events used to be elegant. Now we're letting anyone in, and it shows." Angela didn't answer. Barrett quietly reached for a breadstick, not even glancing her way. Celeste pushed again. "Come on, You can't seriously be falling for this whole mystery man with the golden heart narrative. It's not a movie. Angela turned to her. No, she said coolly, it's real life. And in real life, good people don't always wear the spotlight. Sometimes, they carry the whole room and no one notices until now. Celeste blinked, stunned silent for once. She looked down at her wine glass, gripping the stem tightly, her phone suddenly in hand as she pretended to scroll, but the glow was fading from her face. In the far corner, Walter remained still. He had seen this kind of night before: celebrations, fundraisers, rooms full of polished people. But tonight was different. His eyes met Patricia's across the room, and he gave her a small, grateful nod. That's when the ballroom doors opened. A tall man entered, shoulders squared, suit sharp but understated. He walked with quiet authority, the kind of presence that didn't demand the room but earned it anyway. Walter's eyes softened. He smiled just slightly, because that man was his son, Dr. Ellis Jennings, renowned cardiothoracic surgeon, Harvard alum, the evening's keynote speaker, and recipient of the National Humanitarian Award for Medical Excellence. Ellis wasn't new to stages. He had spoken at conferences across the country. But tonight wasn't about prestige. Tonight, he wasn't just a doctor. He was a son. The MC adjusted the mic. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce a man whose compassion and skill extend far beyond the operating room. Please welcome Dr. Ellis Jennings. Applause rolled through the room. Some clapped politely. Others stood, recognizing the name. Even Celeste leaned forward, eyes narrowing in curiosity. Finally, she murmured, now that's someone worth meeting. But the next words from the stage were about to rewrite her evening and her assumptions. The lights dimmed slightly. The room quieted as Ellis stepped up to the podium. He wore a crisp navy suit, his posture easy but firm. He took a breath. No nerves, just purpose. Good evening, he said, his voice strong but steady. Thank you to the St. Elias Foundation for this incredible honor. I've received awards before, but this one is different. The crowd stilled. Even the servers paused along the walls. Ellis scanned the tables, then looked straight toward the back toward Walter. Before I talk about medicine, I want to talk about legacy, my legacy. And then he stepped away from the mic. The microphone caught his natural voice. I was born in Newark. My mother died when I was 8. My father worked night shifts at the Children's Hospital. Some of you may have met him tonight. He's seated near the back, heads turned. Celeste looked over, her expression puzzled. My father, Ellis continued, used to come home with his hands raw from cleaning solutions and his shoes soaked from scrubbing floors. Yet every morning, before the sun came up, he'd sit with me and run through spelling lists. Every weekend, he'd borrow books from the library and read them aloud while I sat at the kitchen table, pretending not to listen over my cereal. He gave a small smile at the memory. We like to tell a neat little story in rooms like this that success comes from talent, discipline, and hard work. And that's partly true, but the rest of the story, the foundation, is built by someone else. Someone whose name doesn't appear on the program. He paused, letting the weight of that truth settle. Someone who scrubbed tile floors while his kids studied cell biology. Who worked graveyard shifts so I could make it to pre-med lectures. Someone who gave without asking for anything back. Walter remained still, watching his son with soft eyes, his posture relaxed. Ellis stepped aside and gestured toward him. Everyone, I'd like you to meet Walter Jennings. The man who saved my life before I ever saved anyone else's. No applause came at first, not because of indifference, but because something deeper had taken hold. Reverence, perhaps, a realization that cut through the glitz of the evening. Ellis stood silent for a beat longer, giving the moment space to land. Celeste blinked. Her jaw didn't drop, but her eyes said everything: recognition, regret, and something else that hadn't been there before. She leaned back slowly, the words she'd spoken earlier lingering in the air like thick smoke. Near her, Barrett Crowley leaned in toward his wife. That's his father, he whispered. Angela nodded slowly and said nothing. All around the ballroom, people began reevaluating. The evening had taken a sharp turn, no longer just another night of catered dinners and polite accolades. Something authentic had. And the man who had spent the first hour invisible was now at the center of it all. But the night wasn't finished. One last voice still needed to be heard. Ellis remained near the podium, allowing the stillness to linger. It wasn't awkward, it was meaningful. Then he returned to the microphone. I was asked to speak about innovation tonight, he said, adjusting the stand. But I think we often confuse innovation with convenience. True power comes from sacrifice, the quiet kind that doesn't make headlines. He glanced again at Walter. When my acceptance letter from Harvard came in, my dad didn't say much. He just nodded, then went back to ironing his uniform. It took me years to realize he'd sold his car to help pay for my books and flights. A stir rippled across the crowd. A woman at table 3 dabbed her eyes with a napkin. A man nearby cleared his throat, reminded perhaps of a time he had judged someone by their shoes. Ellis continued, his voice even. In medicine, we talk a lot about mentorship, how doctors pass on their wisdom. But sometimes, the greatest teacher isn't wearing a white coat. Sometimes, he wears work boots and carries a ring of keys. A few smiles appeared, knowing ones, the kind that say I've overlooked that too. Celeste sat motionless, not defensive, not angry, just still. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her gaze moved between Walter and Ellis, as if rewriting the memory of her own remark, wishing it had never happened. But it had, and now everyone in the room would remember it. Ellis shifted gears. Every life I've helped save began with a sacrifice someone else made. That's the real story behind this award tonight. He took a breath. I wanted my father here because he's never once asked for recognition, but I think it's time he received it. With that, Ellis stepped away from the microphone and walked off the stage, not toward the press, not toward the VIPs, but straight to Walter. He bent down, whispered something into his father's ear, and helped him rise. There was a quiet power in Walter's movement, no theatrics, no grand gestures, just presence. The room burst into applause, not the polite kind, the kind that swells and sustains, genuine. Walter didn't wave or bow. He simply placed a hand on his son's shoulder and offered a soft smile. The kind that says, I see you, thank you. This moment isn't about me, but I'm here. Alice gestured to a staff member, whispered something, and in seconds, another microphone appeared beside Walter. He hesitated briefly, then stepped forward. I wasn't planning to speak tonight, Walter began, his voice deep and steady. But I'd like to share one thought. The room went still. There's no such thing as a small job, he said. Only small thinking that value comes from a title. Silence. I cleaned floors so my son could walk across them with confidence. I gave what I had not because I had to, but because I wanted to. And I never saw that as weakness. He looked around. But I've been in rooms like this before, enough to know that some folks only see the uniform and nothing else. His gaze met Celeste's, not with anger, but with honesty. And that's okay. Because a man's worth doesn't come from who acknowledges him. It comes from what he builds. He stepped back. The applause returned, this time slower, more personal, heavy with meaning. Celeste stayed seated, her skin burning not from shame, but from realization. She had always known how to read a room, how to flatter, how to steer. But this moment couldn't be navigated with charm. Walter hadn't even addressed her directly, but his words had landed right where they needed to. When the applause settled and the MC returned to close the night, Celeste stood and quietly left her table. But instead of heading for the exits, she moved toward the stage. Walter was still there, speaking softly with Ellis. His son had one hand on his back, a simple gesture of deep respect. Celeste approached, hesitated, then stepped closer. Mr. Jennings, she said. Walter turned. His face was calm, neutral. I owe you an apology, she continued, her voice quieter than usual. What I said earlier was unfair, ignorant. He gave a slow nod, letting silence carry the weight. I made an assumption, and I was wrong, deeply wrong. Walter waited before replying. I appreciate the apology, he said plainly. But you didn't just assume something about me. You revealed something about yourself. Her breath caught. I know, she said, voice cracking slightly. And I have to carry that now. He studied her, not cruelly, just honestly. Then do something good with it, she nodded. Not for appearance, but because there was nothing else to do. She stepped away, leaving father and son to their quiet moment. Across the ballroom, the energy had changed. People spoke more intentionally now. A few approached Walter to shake his hand, others just watched humbled. Angela Crowley, standing by the dessert table, turned to her husband. You know what I'll remember most from tonight, what? That a man who said fewer than 200 words taught 100 of us more than we've learned all year. Barrett nodded. We needed it. At his table, Walter eventually sat again. He sipped water, not champagne. His suit was modest, his posture steady, but he was no longer unseen. Ellis stood beside him, letting the spotlight pass him by. Because he knew exactly what this night had truly been about. And now, so did everyone else. The tone of the evening had shifted not because of scandal, not because of viral theatrics, but because truth had finally been spoken. And once that happens, it cannot be unheard. There were no fireworks, no dramatic exits, just quiet change. And for a room full of people who thought they had it all figured out, that kind of change cut deeper than anything else. Outside, the valet line curled around the block. Conversations drifted into the night. But inside, the ballroom emptied slowly, tables half cleared, chairs uneven, programs forgotten. Walter remained seated, unhurried. Ellis stood beside him, one hand in his pocket, the other resting gently on the back of his father's chair. "You all right, Pop?" Ellis asked. Walter chuckled. "Tired, but good." He looked across the space one more time, as if taking in a memory he hadn't expected to make. Not because of applause, but because of something that couldn't be measured. Change. The kind you feel, not here. The kind that lingers in people's eyes. They stepped outside together into the cooler air. A few event staff still lingered, speaking in quiet tones, jackets folded over their arms. One of them was Nora Hastings, the woman who'd stayed silent earlier, when Celeste made her comment. She walked up to Walter. "I didn't say anything when I should have," she said. "And I've been thinking about that all night." Walter smiled gently. "Takes more strength to reflect than to react." "You did just fine," she returned the smile, grateful. "I won't stay quiet next time." Walter nodded. "That's what matters." As she walked away, Ellis turned to his father. "I've given speeches at medical conferences," he said. "But that one, that was different." Walter raised a brow. "Because I was in the room," Ellis grinned. "Because this time they were listening." They walked to their car. No cameras, no red carpet. Just a father who once mopped hospital floors and a son who now ran them. Back inside, Celeste sat alone at her table, staring at a half-empty wine glass. Her driver had been waiting for 20 minutes, but she hadn't moved. It wasn't shame, not quite. It was something harder to define. She reached for the Gala program and opened it again. Under the keynote section, she reread Ellis's bio, this time with new understanding. At the bottom, in small type, "Special guest Walter Jennings." She closed the booklet and stood. She wouldn't forget his name again.